All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on episode 120 of Blowback, Exposing Imperial Decline. I am the only host today with two special guests, Dr. Charles Mcelvey live from Cuba. I believe he's in Havana. We got Chris Black from Campbellford, Canada. And
Right. Yes.
I was very fortunate to get Charles on. We tried to get him on last Friday, and there was, even worse technical issues. There might be a little bit of a delay for him, but we'll see how it goes. So I also included in the description of our video Charles' two most recent articles. One on BRICS, and then the other was on Cuba's the UN vote on Cuba to end the embargo, which of course was the entire world telling the United States to end the embargo, and the U.S. and Israel saying, no, we're not going to do that, and Moldova sustained. But and then I titled our program, "Will Cuba join BRICS?" I mean, that's I think it's a foregone conclusion. At some point, it's going to happen, but that's just kind of the topics we're going to discuss today: Cuba and BRICS. And I know there was a bunch of questions in the chat last week about why is Cuba still struggling? Why are they having blackouts? Why are they still so underdeveloped? And I think there's good reasons for all that. But so, Dr. Mcelvey, thank you for joining us. And I know if you want to just introduce yourself a little bit, I know you're a former professor and you moved to Cuba. You've retired in Cuba. How is that going?
Well, thank you very much, Billy Bob, for inviting me, and it's nice to meet you, Chris, as well. Let me begin by saying that I started traveling to Cuba 25 years ago as a college professor at Presbyterian College in South Carolina. We organized trips to Cuba for our students. And so that was my introduction to Cuba 25 years ago, and I was very much struck by their highly democratic system, a system of democracy that's different from representative democracy, but I think avoids some of the pitfalls of representative democracy, especially for countries that are working from a neo-colonial situation. So I determined to get back to Cuba as much as I could, trying to, go there in the summers and trying to get grants when I could and so forth and so on, and developing programs for my students. And so that was until I retired in 2011. And I'm married to a Cuban woman that enables me to travel freely back and forth between Cuba and the United States in terms of both the Cuban laws and U.S. regulations. And of course, being retired, I can spend a lot of time reading about other socialist projects and during the last 100 years or so, things that I didn't wanted to do as a teacher, but didn't quite have time to do. And so last couple of years, I've been writing a Substack column. And essentially what I'm trying to do is write from the perspective of the third world or the global South. I see a tremendous difference in the discourse and the fundamental parameters of the discourse between the North and the South. And so I'm trying to give a perspective from the South. I don't know if you want me to say more at this point, or if you have a particular question. I guess I have a question. Could you hear what I said?
Yes. Yes, very well.
Okay. Good.
Yeah,
Good.
we can
Good.
hear you. So I don't know if Chris, you have any thoughts or questions?
Well, just my histories. I am not living there. I wish I was. I've been there a number of times. I also began going there, well, I guess, early 90s. And had the same impression, the same experience, and it's always impressed me, the revolutionary spirit there, despite all the hardships. And the last I was there was last March, and despite people saying that conditions were bad, I didn't find them bad. I mean, well, guess I saw some complaints in Havana from some poorer people who were gobbled up CNN's propaganda, but most of the people were still strong and support the revolution, and that was good to see. And there have been a lot of improvements. I just saw today on Telesur that Mexico has just sent 400,000 barrels of oil to Mexico free to help with alleviate the energy crisis. So that's a very good thing. But no, we have a similar history in a way. But I wish I envy you living there, because I would like to experience that as well. So I love Havana and I love everything else.
Well, I want to make clear that I actually don't live here. I live in the United States, and I visit Cuba and for extended periods of time.
Well, the only other anecdote I can say is my father went down, who was a conservative man. Well, he wouldn't be considered that in the States because he supported free healthcare in Canada, but otherwise conservative. But he went down as a retired man to help them run some. He used to be a hospital director, and he was asked to go down with a volunteer group to help redirect some hospitals, and he was there for several months. And he had a chance to do what I never had a chance to do, which was meet Fidel Castro. He was Fidel Castro gave him a medal for his work. So and I asked my father what Fidel was like, even though he was anti. He said he was a great guy. He was a very nice man. He was great to us. So. Okay,
so that's Charles.
Right, Fidel always received with great pleasure. Go ahead, Billy Bob. You're in charge here.
Well, I was gonna suggest. I mean, that's a great story. Chris's dad received a medal from Castro. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I was gonna just ask Charles to discuss his two most recent articles. There was a real long article about BRICS, and then the most recent article was on the embargo. You know, the UN vote of the embargo. But yeah, don't let me monopolize here. Go ahead, Charles.
Right. Well, you did ask a question when you introduced me that I forgot to answer in my initial comments, and that was the question on why there's really continues to be so much difficulty, and the essence of the answer is that beginning in I guess it started in 2017 under the Trump administration, there was what they call here an intensification of the blockade. And the blockade beginning in 2017, and even more so after 2019, is much more intense, much stronger than what existed all these 6 decades prior. And it includes things they're aggressively going after any company anywhere in the world, any company, any shipping companies, banks that engage in any kind of transaction with Cuba. The U.S. government does this, imposing fines on these companies, threatening them with excluding them entirely from the U.S. market. And so banks and companies are kind of in a position that, the U.S. market is extremely important. Can they sacrifice that, for this small island nation, no matter how noble and no matter how much they would like to have relations with Cuba? So this has really had a tremendous impact. There have been incidents of that the U.S. Cuba paid for shipping of an petroleum oil tanker ready to set out for Cuba, and the bank refused to do the financial transaction, so that an oil tanker that they were expecting to arrive, which they need for their electric system, in fact did not arrive, and they have to scramble to figure out, well, what can we do to deal with this? I mean, can we find another bank? Can we find another supplier? Sometimes they can't, and sometimes they can. And so this is really created. It's a very aggressive. Cubans describe it as part of a unconventional war against Cuba, which their intellectuals see as some describe it as World War III. Not in the form that when we were young, we imagined it, as a kind of a nuclear exchange. This is a different kind of war. It's unconventional. It uses economic sanctions like those that I've been describing. It uses ideological distortions, taking advantage of its control of the internet, and so it's directed against any country that defies the world order in its current form, its established form, which is very much in decadence. And so I forget the exact number. I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 countries that have been sanctioned in some way by the U.S. government. And so, but meanwhile, these countries persist. I mean, this is one of the things. Billy Bob, you sent me a little thing of yours to review, and I found in it that. One of the things that I think is very typical of the Western point of view is that many of us on the left know that the United States is an imperialist power, and it does things that it has according to the fundamental principles of the world order, the fundamental principles laid down, for example, in the United Nations. They have no right to do. But what we often don't see is the persistent efforts of the nations that are the victims of all of this, the victims of the structures of neocolonialism, increasingly arriving to understand how the basic economic and political structures of the world are really perpetuating their underdevelopment, and they need to transform them. And there's, in a certain sense, a great anti-imperialist movement led by countries of the global South and the global East. China is, of course, a very important actor in this. It's not only that China has ascended and has become, in a certain sense, in some ways, a world power, but it also has an ideological perspective in its foreign policy that is in tune with what was articulated by the third world nations beginning in the 1950s and 1960s, the Bandung Conference, and the formation, the establishment of the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement in 1961 or 63, when it was founded, it had something like 27 nations. Today, it has 120 nations that are members of the non-aligned movement. Every 3 years they meet and they issue declarations condemning the basic structures of the neocolonial world system, calling for fundamental changes, which they outline what these changes need to be in order to make it possible for the historically colonized nations to develop their economies, which they define as the most important human right of all. The right of a nation to have sufficient sovereignty that it can use its natural and human resources to try to develop its economy. So I think that this was a kind of a long way of elaborating on the point that this is something that we in the West don't appreciate enough. We know that the world powers of which we are a part are behaving very badly, but we don't give enough emphasis to the dignified, scientifically intelligent response and persistent response of the nations that have historically have been neocolonized. And just in psychological terms, it would help us to understand this and appreciate it, because they speak in they use moral platitudes. Fidel used to say things like, "No one has the right to lose faith in the future of humanity." I mean, this kind of thing is constant. Every child has the right to a school. Every child has the right to be fed. There's no cynicism in their discourse. I mean, their idea is that we understand the basic components that ground and are the foundation of a much more sustainable world system, a world system in which there's cooperation and mutually beneficial trade among nations, whether they be powerful nations or small and weak nations. That they believe in these things. They believe that it's possible to create it, and so they are determined and they are persistent. And it would really be good for our soul to know that there is within the human species this capacity to continue to dream, to continue to believe, to work with intelligence to construct a much more sustainable world order. It would be a great cure to our cynicism that exists in the nations of the North, and particularly the United States. I'll give you others a chance to jump in now. Sorry, I get carried away.
No. It was a great summary of the last 60 years of history and the problems we face with the imperialist powers and the anti-colonial struggle, which I just saw a video this morning of Putin at the BRICS, again, making Russia as inherited the Soviet Union, again, a major factor in the anti-colonial movement. He actually referred to the colonialism of the West as inflicted on Africa and Latin America still, and that Russia intends to oppose that with China and the DPRK. But I think we have to also go specifically to Cuba. Maybe I could add my thoughts on that about why they're so vicious with regards to Cuba in particular. Well, they did this with the Soviet Union. They embargoed the Soviet Union the entire period it existed, which caused enormous problems and stresses after the war. But the Cuban, not only did they embargo, it's a war against Cuba, a trade war, and they've also taken military action and terrorist raids against Cuba from time to time, try to assassinate its leaders. But they don't allow Americans to go there illegally. Why is that? Like they didn't in the Soviet Union. Why? Because they do not want the working people of the United States to see what's possible in a socialist government and what the people, even a poor country like Cuba, what they can do for the people. Because if you applied those methods to the United States, everybody would be better off, except the rich classes, the elites, the financiers, and the industrialists who don't want that. So that's why I was in Mexico once, and somebody said, "Oh, well, you can't go to Cuba." I said, "No, everybody can go to Cuba." It's well, Cuba's a prison country. I said, "No, you're the one in the prison. Your government tells you are free to go only where they allow you to go. You're not free to travel as an American. You're only free to travel where they permit you to travel. They tell you can't go to Cuba, you can't go to Cuba. You're in a prison as far as that's concerned, or any place else. They say you're not a free people. Your passports are not useful. You can't go there. And why? Because they don't want you to see what's there. Instead, they feed you with rumors and nonsense and lies about the poor state of the situation in Cuba. But the embargo, yes, all illegal. We had the General Assembly vote again condemning the United States embargo. Everybody voted for it except these small countries in the United States. And yet the United States claims to be the beacon of light, the leader of the world, the beacon of democracy and fair humanity. I mean, the hypocrisy is so deep, if you step in it, you're going to sink into a swamp. So Cuba's been under so much pressure. When I was down there in March, I was surprised that the place we were staying, we went to Havana, Veradero, of course, and in the hotel we're in Veradero, there are some Russians, some Chinese, but most of the people were East Germans, Canadians, some Mexicans, and people from Venezuela, places like that. But I was sad to see that the Canadians all came down bringing things for the Cuban people, books and music, school streets, and this and that. But they don't support the socialist government. They always undermine it. All the tourists, the Canadian tourists, they were undermining and spreading rumors about the workers and the workers' conditions at the hotel, which were all lies. And my lady and I had several confrontations with people spreading false rumors and undermining the government. Now, tourism is a very big thing there because that's one of the sources of income they have left, and yet it's a double-edged sword because the tourists coming in are also trying to undermine the local population. I spoke to a Communist Party officer member, Veradero, and he discussed this. He said, "Yeah, it's a real serious problem because you need the money from the tourists. On the other hand, they come down, a lot of them, not all of them, but from Canada especially, with this attitude: oh, we love the Cuban people, we want to help them, and because they're so worse, bad off because of the government. That's the stick, not because of the American embargo." It's just disgusting, really, what goes on there, and we were ashamed actually to be Canadians down there. Whereas the East Germans, all the Germans we met there were all communists, all wishing the DDR still existed, and hating the present German government and attitude towards Russia and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's I think that's why they're so vicious towards Cuba, because it's so close to the United States. It's just across the street, really, and they don't want people. They want to crush it viciously because they don't want that infection of socialism to spread to the United States.
Let me jump in real quick, Charles. It occurs to me that you might have an oscillating fan, or maybe your window's open. Every time I see your shirt ruffling a little bit, we get a little bit of feedback, like the wind is in your microphone. Is it possible to?
My window's open. My window's open. Yes, it is.
Okay.
Except it's going to make it a little warmer in here. But sure, I'll be because we certainly don't have air conditioning here. I'll.
Where are you at?
Give me a second. I'll close it.
Yeah, no problem. That'll be great for the audio. So I appreciate that. Yeah, poor Charles is gonna get a little bit hot, but yeah, there really was some pretty bad constant feedback from the wind in the microphone. So I think that'll be improved.
Yeah,
very good. Yeah, that's good.
Right. No, that'll help. This is a window, by the way, that has a view of the sea. It's probably about 10 or 15 blocks. I'm on the 5th floor, so I've got a good view.
Great. Oh, and then one thing I have to say, the positive
so Billy Bob,
thing
don't speak badly about my window. I love it.
But I can add something positive to my trip to Cuba a few months back, was that when we were there, a Russian ship arrived with 25,000 tons of wheat, which was delivered by Russia for free, which was direly needed because they had a lack of wheat for bread. And that was very welcome. And I noticed we drove around and we saw a lot of investment from China and South Asian countries. So the Chinese are drilling for oil off the coast, but they're not doing it in the water, so they don't want to pollute. They're slant drilling from the land. The Malaysians have built 3 hotels in Havana, I believe. I heard the Vietnamese are going to build 3 resorts in the resort areas. There's some construction in Havana. It's not all down. There are things coming in. There is investment, and China and Venezuela, Russia really are helping Mexico now as well. And while I was at the hotel, several buses drew up, and out of those buses poured about 200 Mexicans. And then there was bands, and they were playing and singing. And I wondered, what's this all about? Who are these people? So I walked in, be inquired, and a Mexican work brigade had come in from the old Revolutionary Party. So They had come from Mexico to work in the fields as they do every year, and they were stationed they were welcomed at the hotel and stayed with us for about 2 days. They were terrific to talk to them. The spirit and the revolutionary zeal was for Mexicans. I was surprised that still existed in Mexico, but it does, and it was very nice to see all those Mexicans there helping their comrades. Mexicans are very well respected in Cuba, and I hear that vice versa. So
yes.
So Charles, I think in the West, among the,
there has.
the
I wanted to make a comment that.
Go ahead.
Okay. It was. I just wanted to say that there has been an evolution in Cuba's relationships with the world. Of course, under the era of the Soviet Union, a lot of Cuba's economic relations and cultural and diplomatic relations were educational exchanges and so forth were with the Soviet Union and the Socialist Bloc, a great deal in the former East Germany. That, of course, collapsed when the Soviet Union collapsed. And so Cuba began to develop relationships, especially with Canada and Western Europe. Beginning in the 1990s. This was the era in which the blockade was not so stringent. And so nations and companies and banks in Europe were not being harassed by the United States for developing relations with Cuba. So that was the mechanism that Cuba used to basically recover from the impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the period that known as the Special Period. At the beginning of the 21st century, there occurred a revitalization of the Third World movement. To develop South-South cooperation, to develop an alternative. And it was very much fed by the reaction of the peoples of the Global South to the negative impact of the neoliberal project on their nations. And so there was a kind of return to the basic principles that had guided the Third World movement in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s. And so at that time, Cuba began to develop relations with the Global South and the Global East, or I used to say the Third World plus China, including Latin American nations. And this was the period in which Latin American there was the so-called pink tide, where progressive movements, again, in reaction to the neoliberal project, and the peoples were pushing for a return to some kind of fundamental principles that used to guide the quest of the neocolonized peoples. And so Cuba began to develop relations with countries that they had relations, but they were trying to expand the economic trade that they had with these nations, and that's been a strong tendency since the beginning of the 21st century. This is the era of Hugo Chavez in Latin America, the return of the Sandinistas, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and Evo Morales in Bolivia. And progressive governments in Argentina and Brazil, and so now, so that's been a tendency. But then, with the beginning of the, you could really say it was around 2017, the launching of the unconventional war against all of these nations that were trying to develop an alternative. They didn't conceive it as something of hostility to the West. They saw it as a way of, they wanted to protect their sovereignty. And that meant that they had to develop different kinds of relations than what the West had historically offered. They invited all kinds of Western companies and Western countries to participate in this process, to trade with them, but to trade with them on different terms that respected their sovereignty, respected their right to fundamental human needs, not simply be the victim of an economically exploitative process. So this movement of South-South cooperation, developing an alternative to the structures that were a legacy of colonialism, this movement really began to accelerate with the developments in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, the expansion of the West toward Russia, increasingly using sanctions, increasingly using the dollar not as an international medium of exchange, but as a mechanism for punishing any kind of rebellious country. The aggressive attitude of the West was making even more untenable from the point of view of the global South as well as the global East, the existing world system. So this has accelerated this process. And meanwhile, the United States is increasingly imposing penalties on European companies and European individuals who have any kind of relation with Cuba. So naturally, this is going to drive more and more this tendency. Let's turn to the Chinese. Let's turn to Russia. And meanwhile, Russia and China are saying, we are in agreement with this world that the people of the global South are trying to construct. And Cuba was a very important example simply because it was clear about what it was trying to do, and it was known for its persistence against the United States. It was a highly visible, highly recognized country in spite of the fact that it was small. So you see, 10 years ago, you would see a lot of European tourists here. Today, they're still around, but not in the numbers that they were. And more you're going to see, like, for example, Chinese tourists here. That's been the tendency in recent years.
Yeah, there were some Chinese at our hotel, though half of them turned out to be from Montreal. When I spoke to them, they were from Chinatown and Montreal.
Right.
But there were some
Right.
mainland Chinese that
Right.
It was funny. But yeah.
Right.
So what do you want to? I'm not sure if Billy Bob wants to interject there before I do.
Well, no, it's great.
I think you should.
I love listening to Charles, and I'm just trying to figure out how to facilitate this discussion. I know last episode on Friday, people were wondering in the comments, why isn't China doing more? Can you speak directly to that? I know Cuba is labeled as a state sponsor of terrorism, which does allow the United States to come down pretty hard on any bank or entity, financial entity that wants to invest or do business with Cuba. But can you talk about the criticisms of Western leftists complaining that China isn't doing more? Or, can you speak to that?
Well, I guess every country could always do more, but they've got their own issues. China's under attack itself. It's being embargoed. Squeeze is increasing every day with the Americans and their allies in Canada, Europe. So, but they do help. As I said, there's this Chinese oil exploration companies operating there. There are some Canadian ones still operating there, although Canada has not been as friendly with Cuba lately in the last 3 years as it used to be under American pressure, but they're still operating. But the Chinese are operating there. The Russians are delivering free food. The Mexicans and they've delivered oil. The Chinese are investing in other projects there, I heard about. So there is investment. They are trying to help, and they're talking about increasing that aid. And I think China called recently for maybe a mass mobilization to send things in to help solve this present crisis and get them over it and reestablish their their entire electrical. I think they were willing to come in and restore, or Russia was, I can't remember now, to restore their entire electrical grid or rebuild it with China. I think maybe Russia and China might have a project in mind like that. So things are happening. So when the left starts criticizing China, it's usually these Trotskyist groups who don't understand what's going on. And they got a project, which is to always say that any socialist government is bad and would be better if they were dismantled and reestablished, which would never take place, of course. And that's their project. Smear the Cuban government, smear the Chinese, the DPRK. They're not really socialists, blah, 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 blah. They're agents of imperialism, and that's what they are. But that's the left that says that. Because the left understands the reality of the world situation and the struggles these countries are facing against the United States and their allies, their gang, would realize it's not that easy to do everything you want to do. You know, they got limited resources. Sure, China's a huge economic power now, but they got problems with Taiwan. They got problems with the Americans threatening them all the time. And that's why the United States wants to break up Russia into pieces. Then they're going to take part of China. That's the plan. It's the grand plan. That's what they intend to stick to. That's why we risk World War III. The Russians and the Chinese know that. The interesting question that comes to my mind, I raised this before, though, is the effect of the fact that Russia's main allies are all communist socialist states, which is ironic considering that they're established by overthrowing the socialist government in Russia. Yeah, yet now all their allies are communists and socialists: Vietnam, Laos, China, Cuba, Venezuela is semi-socialist, Iran, so Islamic socialist version of that, and so on and so forth. That must have an effect, and you see that on Russia. I think, as I said before, back last February, there's a meeting at the Kremlin with all the parties. Putin called in all the party leaders, and Zyuganov for this KPRF was asked to speak last, and he said, "What do you have to say, comrade?" And he said, "Well, comrade Vladimir, I think it's about time. Don't you think that we should return to basic socialist principles?" And I expected Putin to say, "Well, my comrade friend, it'd be great, but we tried that, didn't work." He didn't say that. He said, "That's a very good idea. We should study that further." That surprised me. And some of the comments Putin has been making since then, if you didn't know better, you would say he's still sort of a socialist. And they're using these command structures to organize the economy, to fight off the sanctions and the war. I don't know. I have my dreams. Maybe it's all an illusion, wishful thinking. But but Russia again is talking as if it's the Soviet Union and supporting the anti-colonial movement, supporting Bandung, supporting the BRICS. I mean, there's a shift going on in a major way, and I think Russia is coming back. I don't think it's ever not going to be totally socialist again, but it's coming back towards principles of sovereignty and other socialist principles which were important, and reestablishing them and supporting them. But why can't it happen in the United States? Where is the thing is not the left in the United States criticizing China, but where is the left in the United States criticizing their own regime and their own economic woes? Complaining about this election, which is not an election, it's a selection of those they've imposed on them.
You want to weigh in, Charles? I think there's a long delay, but Charles, do you have any thoughts on? Were you able to hear everything Chris said?
So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I actually had three comments in response to what Billy Bob and Chris have said. And first, I'm very much in agreement with what Chris's sort of negative discourse in relation to the left, or the so-called left. I really find it astonishing that people that are part of a nation, so-called socialist, but they're really part of a nation that has not succeeded in a socialist triumph, would, in their own nations, would feel that they're in a position to make recommendations to other nations that have accomplished that triumph and are in the process of building, constructing day by day a socialist nation. We have no experiential base for saying what China ought to do or what Cuba ought to do. And it's really that political practice that is the foundation of theoretical development. And we just don't have it. And that's one of the reasons that I decided to spend so much time in Cuba, because the political practice was there as the foundation for the ideas. And it was quite evident in the discourse of the intellectuals as well as the leaders. I mean, it's just amazing to see political leaders who speak truth to the people with this good, solid scientific, using science in the broad sense, including history and social sciences, where the leaders possess a good social scientific analysis of their own nation and of the world, political leaders. And so, that's, I agree with Chris that I really don't have a whole lot of patience with so-called socialists from the countries of the North making recommendations for Cuba. The second point had to do with the question of where Russia is in this whole process. Russia has really emerged. I think I began to notice it maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. Russia has emerged as one of the major actors in this process of anti-imperialist construction. And one of the things that helps it is the fact that in this, the movement, the movement of the construction of an alternative world order that I was referring to earlier, it is not specifically a socialist movement. It is a movement that is led by socialist governments, or I should say, governments that have declared that their nations are constructing socialism, but they don't make a big deal about it. To join in this process, a nation doesn't have to be socialist. It doesn't have to declare that it is trying to construct socialist. The main litmus test is anti-imperialism. The nations in this movement are committed to developing structures that permit their nations to be sovereign, to make their own political decisions and economic choices. So Russia fits nicely in this as one of the leaders, as does Iran, which is, of course, has a trajectory historically a bit different from the third world project, but is very much on board in supporting these nations of the world as being a part of this process of anti-imperialist construction in the world, seeking to develop a world that respects the sovereignty. That's why it's anti-imperialist. It respects the sovereignty of all nations. And you develop trade with such a nation, with other nations, not trying to figure out how you can maximize your own gain, but how you can work with them to figure out what kind of trade relations can you develop, or what kind of investment can go forward in ways that are beneficial to both parties. What Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, always refers to as win-win. A win-win situation. And in a certain sense, if your country in this project, this anti-imperialist country, this anti-imperialist project declares for socialism, well and good. If your country does not, well and good, as long as you are on board with the principle of respecting the sovereignty of all nations. And then the third point on why doesn't China do more? I think China is doing a lot. There are 4 initiatives that China has put forward for the world. One is the so-called Belt New Silk Road, or whatever the exact terminology is. It was launched about 10 years ago, and then there was a launching project for global development, a project for global security. And there was one more. 4 global initiatives that Xi Jinping has announced, and he's announced these things in international forum, such as the speeches to the United Nations, and so when you look at what they're trying to do, they have a lot of resources, but among the things they're trying to do is participate in the development of Africa, and develop win-win relations with governments of Africa. There's tremendous need there, and of course they're oriented toward developing relations with Latin America as a whole. And when this process unfolds, it doesn't happen overnight. They've in Cuba they have a whole series of meetings, a couple meetings a year with entities in Cuba and Russia, where they explore what kind of projects can we develop that are mutually beneficial. And then of course, okay, so they decided they need to do a certain thing, and then these negotiators need to get the money from wherever the money is going to come from. It has to be included in somebody's budget somewhere, and it has to be authorized and distributed and so on. So it takes a little bit of time for these things to develop, and it is usually most of the help that China provides is in that form. It's not I see you're short on beans. Here's a boatload of beans. Although that happens, but for the most part, it's the work, day-to-day work on a long-term basis, developing structures that are going to sustain a mutually beneficial relation in the long term. When Cubans get a little bit frustrated that things aren't better than they are, I always remind them, there's a lot of stuff in the works. Be patient. It's going to arrive, but it takes some time. There is, however, some of this, Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel always likes to tell the story about how when because of the blockade, they ran out of I think respirators, or where people breathe oxygen. And people were deathly ill, literally deathly ill. And at the height of the pandemic, Cuba ran out of enough of these respirators, and the U.S. refused to cooperate in providing them. And so Putin arranged the very next day. Apparently, Diaz-Canel called him, and Putin the very next day sent an airplane full of nothing but these respirators. Diaz-Canel is always talking about that story, saying that without Russia, we would have died. And then Vietnam has recently unloaded I don't know how many tons of rice just as a donation recently. My Cuban wife wasn't really pleased with that because she thinks Vietnamese rice is bad. She much prefers Brazilian rice, and I say to her, look, the Vietnamese, they're the inventors of the cultivation of rice, so I think they know what they're doing. But in any event, these nations are present, cooperating with him. There's a whole lot of priorities that have to be taken into account. You need to take into account the short term versus the long term, and anyone with a long term view is going to have confidence in the Cuban leadership and their capacity to survive. They say we're going to overcome the blockade without it being lifted. The U.S. is going to continue being imperialist. This is something everybody quotes Che. Che always said that. Imperialism will always be imperialism. And so what you need to do is figure out how to survive in spite of that fact. So they are on a day-by-day basis developing long-term relations with the nations of the global South and globally, and it's not just China and Russia. It includes Nicaragua and, of course, Venezuela, which has gone through its own attacks and the unconventional war, and Mexico and there's nations, a small nation like Honduras, under the present political leadership, is interested in developing relations with Cuba. This is a historic, long-term process that Cuba has always been in favor of developing. It's easier to say than it is to put in practice, and that's the thing that is really makes the present anti-imperialist movement more very advanced. They are putting their dreams into practice on a daily basis, and meanwhile, the Western powers fall increasingly into decadence in the sense that they don't understand the problems of the world. They don't understand what they need to do to actually help themselves in the long term. And that's a sign of decadence when the leadership and the elites of a nation are themselves confused. And I feel very badly about this because I am, after all is said and done, I am a patriotic American. I love my country. And I would like for it to do what is good for itself in the context of a broad understanding. So it occurs to me, I think what a disaster Cuba was in the 1950s before Fidel came along, it occurs to me that what is needed in the United States is to read these emerging global tendencies that have really been emerging since the 1950s. But have become increasingly evident in the first 25 years of the 21st century. To understand what is occurring, to get on board with the construction of a more sustainable world order, as they say, characterized by peace and prosperity, and so there needs to be an awakening. Sectors of the elite who are observing, well, all you got to do is look, which of course generally people in the United States don't do. But you see these tendencies. You see that there are positive tendencies for America. So for the United States and for the West in general. And so for nations to be the members of the elite to begin to see this and develop a kind of reform from top down. Or the other possibility is that sectors of the people begin to see it and develop a kind of process that involves, it's essentially a revolution, not violent, using the electoral processes for the nonviolent taking of political power, taking control of the government away from the elite, and to guide the foreign policy of the nation toward cooperation with the other nations of the world. Those are two possibilities that I hope. I don't think I'll live to see it, but I hope that someday it does occur. And this is one of the things that I really, one of my negative discourses toward the left in the United States, saying this is what you need to be talking about. It is your duty as intellectuals, supposedly committed to seeking to understand the truth and teaching that truth to your people. That's your duty. And it seems to me that the left in the United States has historically failed to do that. But it does in no sense precludes that there might be an awakening in the future, because all you need to do is look openly with an open mind, not with a prejudged attitude that Cuba needs to do this or Cuba needs to do that. Looking with an open mind what the neo-colonized peoples of the world are accomplishing, and to see that that is a positive thing for humanity, and to realize that there are very few reasons in the world in which we live today to be hopeful or positive about the future. But this process of the South and East, this is a reason for hope. Okay, I'm done for the moment.
Well, I agree with you. A couple of examples come to mind. I was in North Korea 20 years ago, and I met with many senior leaders, and they were telling me how bad things got when the Russians cut off the oil supply with the Yeltsin regime. And it almost destroyed. They said we almost went under, where the two typhoons destroyed the agricultural system, electric grid, no oil, and they bowed and succumbed to the United States pressure to denuclearize. But they were betrayed by them. But finally, the regime changed, and they got their oil supplies back from Russia. Now, Russia and DPRK are among the staunchest of allies, which is quite amazing, because the Juche idea of communism, according to them, is the best. I mean, and they're very staunch. So it's a bit surprising that the Russian government, which is ostensibly capitalist, I don't think it is really capitalist. I think it's a mix of things now. But so you had a counter-revolution take place in the USSR. It was not even legally dissolved, but nevertheless, structures were set up of a capitalist government. And it was a disaster. Russia was looted. It became basically a colony of the United States for about 10 to 15 years in Europe, in Germany. It was absolutely looted. Lost trillions of dollars until somebody, we're not even sure who, how, brings back into this picture this guy Putin and all the people around him and behind him, because he wasn't alone, and pulls it all back from the brink and starts going back, not to socialism exactly, but it's not all, nothing's all, not all the industries aren't privatized yet, and then some are being renationalized. It's a mix of things. And then we see now Russia, which abandoned Cuba and cut off the oil supplies and pulled their big base, their radar base out of Cuba, is now coming back, sent its ships there several times, and to Venezuela, to tell the United States we have our arms around these countries. Don't touch them. We're protecting them as well. We're here. That was a big signal when the Russian fleet showed up in Venezuela and Cuba. The Canadians even sent down their little patrol frigate to compete with that. We're in Havana Harbor too at the same time. But they didn't allow people to tour that ship, or the Russians allowed people to tour their ships. So yeah, I think where am I going? I guess I'm saying that the United States, because it is the biggest imperial power, the imperial power now, since Britain has been reduced to a petty state, really. Is there any hope for the imperialist character of the United States being dismantled? I think there is. I don't think. I mean, Che said, well, they're always going to be imperialists, but that assumes that there's no change. It's just permanent, and nothing's ever permanent, as Marx would say. And there's nothing permanent in life or history. Things evolve, and they're always continually changing, and there's always a consequence and a reaction. But so I think that's not. I don't think we should be. I think we have to be pessimistic, but I don't think it's totally hopeless. Although, do we have the time? I don't know, with the climate change and everything else. But here's a good question. Where is the left? Jose Saramago wrote in his notebooks a small essay saying, because he was a member of the Portuguese Communist Party, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Where is the left? Even in my own party, where are you? What are you doing? You've descended into some sort of liberal, social democratic. You talk revolutionary, but you're not really acting in a revolutionary manner and getting out there and trying to tell the people what the benefits of this are. No matter what the risk is, but there seems to be people are afraid to go out, and we're under pressure. We get arrested. We do this. Well, okay, that's what happens. I mean, you want to struggle, you don't want to struggle. Can't call yourself a revolutionary if you're not willing to struggle. But I don't think it is very pessimistic though in the situation in the United States where the control of the levers of power is by this sort of factions that composing these two so-called parties, which have no program for the benefit of the American people that I like to see whatsoever. And yet people suck this up as if it's just mother's milk, and that's what the situation is always going to be. Um,
Mhm.
and I don't understand where I mean, I grew up like you guys. Well, you did, Charles, in the 60s and 70s, the big protest movements of the Vietnam War mainly, but also about other things, the Soviet Union. And we were being arrested all the time and hitting, beaten up by the police and thrown in the Huskow, and that was common. Everybody was everybody's mass protests, and Kent State people were shot. Well, that actually stopped it, I guess, that shooting. But where I don't see, there's no student movement now worth anything. There's no peace movement worth anything. It's active, really. This all seems to be just, I don't know, being paralyzed. Um, and that dismays me because I thought when I was a young man in my 18, 19, 25, that it would be better. It would increase the student and the people's, the workers' movements would increase. But I guess the collapse of the Soviet Union really really depressed a lot of people and had a major effect on that. But it is disappointing as a person of my age to see where we are now, as opposed to where we were when I was young.
Charles, give us some optimism.
Well, I think the key is leadership. Leadership emerging from those who understand. Um, the in the 60s, I certainly would have thought that we would have been more advanced than we are now. But actually, I could see back then certain tendencies in the left that were dysfunctional, that really almost could be deliberately designed to limit our influence among our own people. And I think you need to be clear about that. I think you need to be clear that of significant numbers of the people, your own people, and we include all kinds of folk, people from Middle America, and not just to people from elite universities in the Northeast and Midwest. And so
So that's unfortunate. I know during several moments of the broadcast, like there was at least a 5-second delay. So you broke up for a second, Charles, and we couldn't hear you. But you started to talk about leadership.
Well, if I can interject, while Charles is getting back online there, I agree with what he said. I posted, maybe you saw it on Facebook a couple of days ago, the final speech of Stalin. And it's wonderful because he calls for world peace and cooperation in a very eloquent manner. But he said something very interesting. He said in the West, the problem is that the communist parties, the socialist parties face immense struggles and they're suppressed and they're kept out of the media. They have difficulty even talking to the people, getting close to the people. And in this situation, you have to support those liberals. So you have to have a slogan which captures the imagination of the people living in the circumstances they are in these so-called Western democracies. Therefore, if liberalism catches their imagination, then use liberal slogans, but you got to capture their imagination. He was talking about leadership and how you don't have to necessarily immediately talk about revolution tomorrow. You have to go with, as all the great theorists of the socialist struggle have said, you have to get the people to go that way slowly, and realize their own benefit to do so instead of cutting their throats by taking part in the system which exists now.
I think you need to be. Can I jump in here, Billy
Yeah.
Bob?
Yes.
Uh, I think you need to be in touch with the people. You need to appreciate what they care about, and you need to lead them to a larger uh, theoretical understanding. And a lot of them aren't going to be interested in the theoretical understanding, but a significant minority, maybe about 20-25%, are going to really appreciate the alternative theoretical understanding. I base all of this on what Fidel did in in Cuba, and I can see it in certain ways among other leaders of the global South of the last century. And I think in the case of the United States, we need an ideological reconstruction. That the left has to reconstruct its concepts in ways that are deliberately designed to reach out to their own people, and not be quick to dismiss them whenever it is that if they reject leftist slogans, many of them, maybe it's because those leftist slogans were not intelligently devised, and so we need to think seriously about this. And I think that the light on the horizon is that the example for us is before us. The nations of the global South and East are constructing. Let's observe them carefully. Let's see what they're doing. Let's learn from them. And that I do not see any objective reason why leaders or intellectuals in the United States could not learn from these processes, talk in ways that are connected to their own people, discard the ideological divisions that divide us, divide left and right, and look for common ground based on the principle that the people need to be in control of the institutions of the nation, and the nation needs to conduct itself in foreign affairs in ways that respect the foreign policy of all nations, the sovereignty of all nations, and in this. The state has a role to play, but so does private enterprise. This is one of the things that's very interesting about the evolution of socialism over the last 30 years or so in the nations that are constructing socialism. They recognize that private enterprise has its place in the construction of a better world, because when there's space for private enterprise, that means there's space for people to be creative, to be inventive, to invent new things that contribute to the productive process. A nation needs that, but of course, all in the context of a general plan that is formulated by the state. So it's a kind of a mixed economy, but in which the state has a pivotal role to play. I think reformulation, because they're clearly not satisfied with the public discourse, with the options that they presently have, and I think that a well-conceived alternative that it takes into account their needs, that is a patriotic discourse that recognizes the historic achievements in contributing to the development of representative democracy, in contributing to the economic and technological developments of the world. Recognize that all of the revolutionaries of the third world, they didn't diss their own nation. They celebrated the achievements of their nation. A discourse for change in the United States needs to celebrate the history of the United States and its achievements. even though its defects have to be recognized. And that I think that a leader with these capacities, or leaders with these capacities, would be able to take the nation out of its current situation of chaos and confusion and division and destruction. And the thing that they would really have on their side is that a better world is in fact being built in the world. I think most people, the of the United States, in cooperation with other nations, in the development of the world, insofar as a leadership emerges that can explain it to them in these terms.
Yeah, I agree. Many people joke that the biggest and the best capitalist economy is communist China, is run by the communists. The communists run the best capitalist system in the world, and they don't quite understand that, as you say, socialist regimes, socialist systems can be varied depending on the circumstances. Like we saw in Libya, we saw in the Soviet Union, DPRK. They're all different histories, different national cultures, different ideas of how to apply socialism. But Marx and Lenin never said what socialism should look like. They had certain goals to help the people, but the main point was that the working class is in command of the economy, not the capitalist class. And in China, it's quite clear that the Communist Party representing the working people is in charge of the economy, not the capitalist financiers and industrialists. They're allowed to operate, but they're allowed to operate under the guidance of the party. So yes, nothing wrong with capitalism as long as it's controlled by the working people for their benefit.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with making money, having restaurants and cafes and small businesses. Why not? But the problem in the United States is that the financiers and industrialists control every decision, everything about policy, domestic and foreign, and that's why you have no free health care down there. We do here. I don't know why. Because they gave that to us because of the threat of revolution. And they're trying to take it away from us now, but they don't succeed. But yeah, people have to get over this idea that if socialists want to steal things from you or take things, that's the propaganda. Well, if you're going to level everybody down, well, no, you're going to level everybody up, actually. The only people going down are those who are holding too much wealth, who got it from exploiting the working people. So we lost Charles again, but he'll come back, I think.
Yeah. Chris, no, I like, you guys are both saying the same thing. And I totally agree with, Charles' explanation of the way forward, and his criticism of Western leftists, really, trashing the country and, separating themselves from average regular people. And I know in the past, Charles has kind of praised the work of, like Midwestern Marx and that group. And they recently did also form the American Communist Party, which is a very small development. They're still working. We will on Tuesday, we're going to have Slava said she could join us. She's one of the spokespeople for the American Communist Party. And I think they're kind of, they pretty much agree with everything Charles was saying. And that's kind of their approach. And I think it's a good development. But yeah, it is so overwhelming. The obstacles seem so overwhelming to overcome, with the billionaire control of the media, their ability to censor, their total control of both political parties, really a uniparty, their domination of foreign policy, and their willingness to engage in censorship and violence. That is all a lot to overcome, but it is possible, if we can wake people up and get everybody, on the same page about what is happening. But it's a struggle, and it's what we have. It's our lot in life to address that struggle and to do what we can. But I've really appreciated Charles, and I was happy to hear that Charles does not live in Cuba, which means he might have an opportunity to join us without these technical difficulties when he's in the States. Hopefully, he'll have a better connection. But we can maybe wrap up. I mean, I don't know if you guys want to talk some more. I'm happy talking more, but I know we've been going for about an hour and 15 minutes, and we do have
I wanted to make two. I wanted to make two brief points.
Great.
I wanted to make two brief points if I could.
Please. It's a long delay. So if you can hear me, Charles, make your points. We'd really appreciate that.
While he's
having.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. The first point is that I see a question here on the chat. Will Cuba join BRICS? Cuba has solicited BRICS for inclusion in the new category that BRICS has created, partner countries, and Cuba has solicited that, and that the BRICS nations have decided. I believe the number is 13 countries. They have made a list of 13 countries that will be included in this category of yet releasing it until they engage in some formal exchanges with the governments of the nations involved. But there was an article published in a Venezuelan news outlet recently that indicates that Cuba is included in that list of countries. So it seems like Cuba will be joining BRICS as a BRICS partner, a new category. The second point is that I was wondering if the folks who are observing are aware of my column and how to access my column. I don't know, Billy Bob, if that information is available to them.
Yeah, so in the description of the video, and I'll send you the YouTube link, Charles, to the video. But in the description of the video, I've put in a link to your two most recent Substack articles. So obviously, you can access his entire Substack through those articles. Okay. But do you have any other areas besides Substack?
Right. Okay. Very, very right. You mentioned that. Right. It's a Substack column, Charles Mcelvey. Charles Mcelvey without all one word. Charles Mcelvey at Substack is where you can find it.
And Chris, do you want to plug? I think you have a blog too, right, Chris? I know we can catch you on Facebook.
Yeah,
comes out twice a week. See, I can be a capitalist.
Well, in a capitalist world where you have to make money, that's the way it is. I have a blog, but I put it up mainly for my short stories, plays, and poetry. But it's called One Voice of the World, VOYCE, not I. One Voice of the World with a Y, or you put ChristopherBlack.com. It'll come up. But so if you scroll down, that's going to get short stories and poetry. Some of it's quite left and revolutionary. On the right-hand side, you see a list of articles I've written on political, legal issues and international issues, which might be interesting for people. That's listed on the right-hand side. But I was going to say about the communist, I'm glad to hear I heard about the American Communist Party being formed. I didn't know too much about it. I've been associated with the Canadian Party for a long time. Not too active these days, but to me, if you read their party program, it's the best program for the working people of Canada. But the trouble is, as you say, they get no press coverage. Nobody can get. You can get them online, but they're not allowed. They take part in elections, but they're never invited to debates and so on and so forth. So it is a struggle, but we do exist. We're not.
Yeah.
We haven't disappeared.
So
But we just got to find a more, as Charles says, a more effective way of expanding the struggle.
yeah, unfortunately, my own platform here, we're not going to get tens of thousands of views or subscribers to your guys' thing. So it's a struggle all the way around.
Well,
But
you
with
may
great
don't.
guests like
Yeah, but we're about. This is about the only left YouTube channel I've seen. You might still get thousands. Don't keep going.
yeah, no, I haven't given up hope. But no, with you guys are great guests, and with great guests like yourselves, yeah, we're bound to increase our viewership. So I just want to thank you both, and of course, we'll have you both back as soon as possible. But with that, yeah, we'll see everybody on Tuesday for episode 121. Thank you very much, and see you then.
Nice meeting you, Charles. Okay.